Hi, this is Brent the Climate Guru, and we have upcoming in November of this year the Conference of the Parties, which is the United Nations annual climate conference that will take place in Brazil, in Belém, which is the mouth of the Amazon River, where more than 50,000 people will participate, including many heads of state, government heads, and other important figures of various governments. It's interesting because this is in the Amazon, and this is in the mouth of the Amazon River and the Amazon rainforest, which, of course, 60% of it is in Brazil. And Brazil has been under a lot of pressure internationally and nationally to reduce its deforestation. And Lula, the president of Brazil in particular, has been under some pressure. Of course, he took over 2 years ago, his second presidency, after he defeated Jair Bolsonaro, who was famous for deforestation of the Amazon. And Lula promised during his campaign and after and during his first term, he was a protector of the Amazon rainforest and of the indigenous people and other people there, African people as well. The problem is that Lula has made a lot of compromises allowing the production of oil and gas in the Amazon for national economic reasons, and he's being criticized for that. So that's the background of this conference. Most nations of the world will participate, be present. The last conference was last year in Baku, Azerbaijan, and as you may recall, there was a lot of criticism of that conference. We heard last time from a lot of folks, including Greta Thunberg, our famous young climate activist from Sweden. Why was this conference being held in Azerbaijan? This is a petrostate, a country that relies on most of its income from fossil fuels. It had a horrible human rights record, an authoritarian government. So there's a lot of criticism on that. And the one before that was United Arab Emirates, which is also a petrostate. And one of the big complaints now, criticisms, is there were 1,700 representatives, lobbyists from fossil fuel and other polluting industries. So that's also been a big criticism and remains so leading up to this conference. So by way of a little background, the Conference of the Parties, the first one was in 1995, and this was about the time of the Kyoto Protocol, in which nations of the world came together for the first time, really, to hammer out an agreement on climate change. And some of the biggest emitters, major countries of the world, actually entered written agreements to reduce climate change. But it was a small percentage of those countries, which represented about 15% of the emissions, but it was an important first step. So each year thereafter, there's been a COP, Conference of the Parties, and the most important one, of course, was Paris in 2015, where the Paris Climate Accords came together. And the important thing about the Paris Climate Accords is that the nations of the world agreed in principle that global warming threatens the whole history and survival of the planet, all life on the planet, including human beings, and that we should limit global warming above pre-industrial levels, heating of the planet from over the last couple hundred years, which has increased gradually. We should limit that in the future to no more than 2 degrees Celsius and use our best efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That was the goal. 2 degrees Celsius is about 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. We are at a critical juncture in heating of the earth and the amount of fossil fuels that are being emitted by individual nations, by industry, and collectively. We are at a turning point where this is the time where nations of the world, private industry, must recognize and implement strict measures to sharply reduce fossil fuels. We are quickly approaching what are called tipping points, where if certain temperatures are reached, and a lot of climate scientists say that these tipping points may be reached at 1.5 degrees Celsius, and we are now at about 1.4 degrees Celsius increased average global temperatures. Certain natural systems in the world, whether it's deforestation of the forest in the Amazon, whether it's melting of Antarctica, whether it's sea level rise, ocean currents, and other natural systems like the melting of permafrost, they may become irreversible. In other words, permafrost, for example, which holds vast amounts of carbon and other greenhouse gases frozen beneath the earth, they are melting. And if they get to a certain point in melting and release certain amounts of carbon and nitrous oxide and methane, then that further heats the planet and further melts the frozen earth. And so these systems become irreversible. That's an example. So scientists are worried that we are approaching that. So we're at a critical time. The last 10 years have been the hottest decade in the history of Earth as we know it for hundreds of thousands of years. Each year we're hitting record temperatures. So what's been done and what's anticipated at this conference? We're told by climate scientists and the most recent United Nations climate reports that current emissions levels would cause up to 3 degrees Celsius or 3.1 degrees Celsius of warming by the year 2100, the end of the century. That's a huge increase in temperatures. People in Phoenix today are suffering 110 degrees daily, parts of North Africa, the Mediterranean, huge increases in temperature. We're faced with continued drought, which affects production of agriculture, floods, sea level rise. So we are at a critical juncture where the world of nations, collectively and individually, must sharply reduce our fossil fuel emissions. In order to meet the goal of not increasing emissions past 2 degrees Celsius increase, as stated in Paris, we have to decrease fossil fuel emissions three times more than we're doing now. That's an enormous amount. Now, the more ambitious target of not exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius, which scientists tell us is a critical point which we should not exceed because we may trigger these tipping points. In order to keep warming from exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius, we have to have 5 times reduction in fossil fuel emissions than we have now. So the gap of what's been promised, of what we're doing by nations, is huge. Now, against the background of this conference, certain geopolitical events that have taken place. One is the fracturing of certain alliances, and it seems to be an increasing fracturing of relationships between the United States and Europe. There seems to be a new alliance of China and Russia. India seems to be more independent. So that's one of the problems that we're facing, is there's a fracturing of unity of the world of nations. The other obvious problem is Donald Trump, in his first term, withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement. Biden joined it again, so that was disruptive. In Donald Trump 2.0, he has again announced withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement, which is disruptive and doesn't help countries like China get in line and cooperate and reduce climate emissions. In 1995 at Kyoto and at each conference ever since, each country is supposed to submit which are called nationally determined contributions, which is the amount of fossil fuel emissions that each country says it will emit, and the idea is to reduce emissions. So every 5 years, each country says, these are our nationally determined contributions. This is the amount of fossil fuels we expect to emit, and we're working to reduce it, and these are our nationally determined contributions. These are binding requirements that they are submitted every 5 years by each country, estimating how much they're reducing their national emissions, but there's no requirement how they're enforced. So there's required to be reporting, but no requirement of how they're enforced. And that's one of the failures of the Paris Climate Accord and the United Nations climate agreements. In anticipation of this climate conference, nations of the world are supposed to submit their updated national NDCs, nationally determined contributions, how much they intend to reduce emissions in their country. So we have over 190 countries to date. Only about 15 or 20 have submitted their NDCs to date. The only countries that we know specifically that have submitted their NDCs are Australia, Fiji, Kenya, Mexico, Palau, Seychelles, Brazil, who's hosting the conference, and France. It is expected before the conference begins in November that many more countries will submit their NDCs. So where are most of the fossil fuel emissions coming from now in the last couple of decades? Not surprisingly, most of them come from developed countries. For example, the G20 countries, most developed economies in the world, stand for 70% of global emissions. The six largest emitters within the G20 account for 63% of global emissions. Who are they? Number one is China, 30% of global emissions each year. The United States is number two with only 4.5% of the world's population. We emit 11% of global greenhouse emissions a year. Number three is India, 8%, which of course we know is rapidly industrializing. The European Union is 6%. Those are 27 countries. Russia is 5%. And incidentally, Russia has never signed any of the climate accords and has never submitted any proposal for nationally determined contributions. They've totally ignored it, although they have observers. Brazil, hosting this conference, is 2%. Of course, a lot of that is deforestation. Now, the 45 least developed countries collectively only emit 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So we see where it's coming from. It's coming from, obviously, the most developed countries. One of the issues that will come up again and came up at the last conference in Baku, Azerbaijan, is will the wealthy countries provide funding each year for developing countries to mitigate and to find ways to adapt to very dangerous climate change. And they're looking for the wealthy countries of the world to provide funding to do that. After all, they're the ones that have created the mess we're in. At Baku, at the end of Baku, there were a number of things that were agreed to. And one of them was for the developed countries to pledge $300 billion a year by 2035 to give to poorer countries to help mitigate and to deal with, protect their populations from dangerous climate change. The current amount that's been raised has been less than $100 billion a year, so we're falling far short of that. One of the criticisms of the agreement in Baku was that it's not just governments that will provide this money. The details suggest that international funding sources, such as the World Bank, provide a large part of the funding, and private capital, private companies and banks provide part of the money. Another criticism is that China and India are still categorized as developing countries because they have been for a number of decades. But they are really highly developed industrial economies, and they should not be considered developing countries that don't give to the fund for developing countries. They should be considered a developed country, pay money to those countries that are poorer. And rather, they're on the receiving end rather than the giving end. And that's a big criticism. If you look at the historic emissions, by historic we mean over the last 100 years, when the world began to industrialize, particularly in the West, in the United States, in England, and Germany, began to industrialize. What countries are responsible for the accumulated carbon greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere? As we know, carbon lasts for hundreds or thousands of years in the atmosphere after they're emitted. So there's an accumulated amount of carbon. And what countries are responsible for the most accumulated carbon in the atmosphere? The United States is number one. We've been an industrial economy, a huge industrial economy, since the late 1800s. We're responsible for 20% of the accumulated carbon emissions. China's number two at 12%, the EU 12%, Russia 7%, and India 3%. If you look at the per capita tons of carbon, what does each person average in each country? How much do they emit in carbon in each country? For example, in the United States and Canada, it's about 18 tons a person a year of carbon. Russia's 19 tons. The EU is 7.3. Brazil is 6 tons per person. And the least developed countries are much, much lower. They are probably 3%, about 3 tons, 4 tons per person per year. So there's a goal, announced goal in Baku last year that we should reach $300 billion a year by 2035. That rich nations should pay poorer nations One of the other issues that came up in Baku was what is the participation of indigenous and other local traditional groups. In Brazil, for example, there's millions of indigenous people and also African Americans who are a distinct group who live in certain parts of Brazil, particularly the Northeast, where the sugar economy was predominant during the colonial period, and many African slaves were brought over from Africa to work in those. So what is the participation? What is the right at the table? What is the right to receive financial assistance of indigenous groups and African American groups, other local groups to make decisions about these important issues and to receive funding? The president of Brazil and heads of the environmental agencies have stated that climate disinformation is a growing problem. As we know, the fossil fuel industry since the late 70s and early 80s embarked on a very organized, well-financed disinformation campaign to confuse the public about the cause of climate change, to suggest that let's pay researchers and let's put out information that we're really not sure what's causing climate change. It could be this, it could be weather. We're not sure it's fossil fuels. So this disinformation campaign has been very effective, and that has to be addressed. And the president of Brazil says we need to push for information integrity at COP30. Since the conference is taking place in Brazil, in the Amazon, we have to recognize the importance of Amazon rainforests and other rainforests and natural systems that absorb and sequester carbon. And this is critical. So this is being looked at. And again, Brazil is being criticized for allowing development of oil and gas in the Amazon. The other big issue is the countries have made pledges to reduce their national climate emissions. But how do we go from pledges to implementation? How do we enforce these? How do we make the individual nations, how do we enforce them to keep their commitments to reduce fossil fuel emissions? So that's another issue that's come up because there presently is no legal mechanism to do so within the climate accords. So this COP30 really is a turning point when the world of nations must make decisions, drastic decisions, and implement them and keep them to drastically reduce carbon emissions. Otherwise, we're faced with a world, dystopian world over the next century, towards the end of the century and to the next century, where systems that sustain life on Earth, water, air, soil, life on Earth of plants and animals, including humans, are severely at risk. The oceans, which are heating, absorbing 93% of our excess heat that we generate from carbon emissions and the greenhouse effect. And the oceans absorb 25% of the excess carbon, and they're becoming acidic, affecting marine life. So this is the turning point that we have to face, and a failure to increase our ambitions and start developing immediate ways to put the world on course, not to increase above 2 degrees Celsius. We know that it's technically possible with the technology we have with wind, solar, forests, which are sinks, seagrass meadows, mangroves that can be protected from further deforestation and are very important natural systems to absorb and to sequester carbon. They also must be protected. We are in a true climate emergency, and the window of opportunity is closing fast. So let's see what happens at COP30, and we'll keep you updated. Thanks for tuning in to the Climate Guru podcast. Stay inspired, stay informed, and keep taking action for our planet's future. Until next time, and remember, together we can make a difference.